The stage is now set for Super Bowl 59 between the Chiefs and the Eagles, which means it is our final NFL DFS slate of this entire year. We're talking single game for today, breaking down our top plays for this week, talking MVP considerations, value plays, and much more to hopefully close out your NFL DFS season on a high note. This is the Heat Check, a FanDuel Research podcast. My name is JimSannes. I am a managing editor for FanDuel Research, joined here as I am every Thursday by Brandon Gdula. You can find him on X at Gdula13. He is on Blue Sky at Gdula as well. And you can find him at FanDuel Research, where he is the senior managing editor. Brandon, happy Super Bowl week to you. How you doing today?
I'm good. I mean, you're technically not wrong. We're together every Thursday, but this is the last one, which is a bit of a bummer. But you know, I mean, it was a good season. It was nice talking NFL, and I feel like, you know, this one. How do you feel about this matchup? Let me just ask that.
Depends when you ask me.
When? Yeah.
If you would ask me like Monday, it's like last Monday. It's like, yeah, kind of, you know, it's boring. It is whatever. But the more I talk about it, the more excited I get. And usually it's the reverse, where I'm like, oh gosh, I'm so sick of talking about this game. I want Sunday to be here. I'm just annoyed. Whereas now I'm like, okay, I've got some stuff that I like. I've got some bets that I like. I think it's a pretty fun, like, strength on strength situation, Eagles defense versus Chiefs offense, stuff like that. So like, and I know people have grown tired of him, but I genuinely get a thrill from watching Patrick Mahomes still, even in his like current, like kind of neutered form. So it's like, I've grown more fond of it as we've gotten further along in the process.
Yeah, I always like rooting for greatness in sports because you just think about how hard it is to get to the NFL in general, then how hard it is to get to the Super Bowl, and you put everything together and it's like, yeah, but there's still this like one team or not one player. Chiefs are more than just one player, but I think it's awesome. So I'm warming up to it. I mean, like, we had that Rams-Bengals Super Bowl not that long ago, and it's like...
Don't talk to me about that Super Bowl. Don't talk to me about that.
Why is that?
Cooper Kupp costing me thousands of dollars. It was not me costing myself. It was his fault. If he hadn't dropped those passes when he was a rookie and he hadn't fumbled as a rookie, I would have used him in the MVP slot. So it's his fault.
Well... Yeah, we're going to talk about everything regarding this game, kind of more of our overall thoughts, single game strategy. If you haven't played any single game DFS on FanDuel or haven't played a lot or just kind of play it for the Super Bowl, maybe some playoffs. I mean, we got, you know, it's not going to be as structured of a show. Probably case in point, I'm kind of trying to steer the ship here and lay things out a little bit. So
I'm still tilting from the Cup thing, so it makes sense. You might need to do that the full show at this point.
That's wrong right off the bat. But, you know, typically for our in-season show, regular season, we have, you know, a nice process. We're going to get to everything, but it's going to be kind of touch and go when things come up, and we kind of branch off that. But, you know, we're going to be talking single game strategy, you know, recent trends for these teams, overall game thoughts based on Jim's model and everything. So we're going to have you covered. So don't sweat that part.
Yeah, it should be a fun discussion. We're going to break things down, as Brandon said, in depth, getting you ready for Super Bowl 59 from a DFS perspective, letting you know everything you need to know before you fill out your lineups on a Sunday. But first, a reminder to make sure you are subscribed to the FanDuel Research Podcast feed wherever you get your podcast, because even though the NFL version is done, PGA is now back in our lives. We broke down the WM Phoenix Open for this week earlier on. That's going to be every Tuesday. The Heat Check for PGA, talking both betting and DFS over on that side of things. Every Tuesday, FanDuel Research Podcast feed for PGA betting and DFS. But also on our brand new FanDuel Golf Betting YouTube page. We'll put the Heat Check shows up there. Allie McCann has some shorts for us over on YouTube as well. So a lot of good stuff on the FanDuel Golf Betting YouTube page. Check that out there. We'll be on the FanDuel NFL betting YouTube, or the FanDuel football betting YouTube page throughout the offseason too. We're going to talk some draft, talk some futures and stuff like that. We're going to have a win total draft. We've already decided at some point, so I'm excited for that. So if you're watching the FanDuel football betting YouTube page, you will not be neglected during the offseason. Do not worry there, but also check us out on the FanDuel Golf Betting YouTube page. Subscribe to both those, turn on notifications, and leave us a thumbs up. We appreciate those of you who have done so as always. The FanDuel Kick of Destiny is back, and this time it's every Manning for himself. This Super Bowl, two legends will take the field in a sudden death field goal showdown. Peyton versus Eli, live from New Orleans. One kick to claim ultimate family bragging rights. Who will rise to the moment? Pick your winner now in the FanDuel app. And if you back the right brother, you'll earn a share of $10 million in bonus bets. It's the FanDuel Kick of Destiny 3. Make your free pick. And don't forget to tune in to watch the showdown live during the Super Bowl 59 pregame show on Fox at 3 p.m. Eastern. May the best Manning win. FanDuel, official partner of Super Bowl 59. Must be 21 plus and present in select states. For Kansas, in affiliation with Kansas Star Casino, or 18 plus and present in D.C. No purchase necessary. Bonus issued as non-withdrawable bonus bets that expire 7 days after receipt. Restrictions apply. Void where prohibited. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Or visit FanDuel.com/RG. Call 1-888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org/chat Connecticut. Visit mdgamblinghelp.org in Maryland. Hope is here. Visit gamblinghelplinema.org or call 800-327-5050 for 24/7 support in Massachusetts, or call 1-877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY in New York. Now, because we have a new audience for this year, being over on the FanDuel Football Betting YouTube page, some people may be playing NFL DFS single game for the first time, wanted to kind of go through the overall way things work here for a single game DFS and kind of give an overview. I'll give my perspective, and then Brandon, you can talk about some nuances of that. But from a logistical perspective, you can pick any player. Does not matter position. You pick 5 total players to be in your lineup, stay under a salary cap. One of those players is your MVP. That MVP earns a 1.5x multiplier on their points. And because there's no sliding scale, you don't have to do math to figure out, okay, should I pick a guy with a lower salary to be there, stuff like that. Just pick the dude you think will score the most points. Pretty simple for the MVP slot on FanDuel. Again, MVP gets a 1.5x multiplier. You can pick any position, including kicker and defense as well. I don't think we get any offensive linemen in here, which would have been more relevant if like Penei Sewell or Dan Skipper were here. Wish they were, but oh well. We'll talk about that next year with them. But any position, 1.5x multiplier, stay under the salary cap. Those are the basics for single game NFL DFS. Brandon, that's the basics. From an overall strategy perspective, what should people know about single game before they're filling out their lineups?
You kind of have to ask yourself a couple questions when you're building a single game lineup. Anyone who's listened to us in the past knows that specifically Jim likes to lay out assumptions. You're getting 5 players, or including defensive units and kickers here. So like you're getting one shot at how this game unfolds. And yeah, you might be able to roster, not that they won't be in the best possible lineup, but just as an example, you can fit in A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. But if Jalen Hurts throws 1 touchdown and for 150 yards, odds are those 2 players combined aren't going to make the perfect lineup or really help you win a tournament whenever everyone's picking from the same handful of players. So you need to think about what a lot of game flow is required to make that lineup actually work. Now, if you say, I think Jalen Hurts throws for 4 touchdowns and Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown each get 2, therefore Saquon Barkley doesn't have a big game, those are the types of things you have to ask yourself. So that's one of the questions. Another question is things like contest selection. If you're playing a head-to-head against someone in the lobby or a friend, you're playing against a couple of your buddies, something like that. You don't have to get that awkward to build the best possible lineup. But if you're playing in a large field tournament and you build a lineup, and let's say you have Saquon and you get Mahomes in there and you kind of get like where you think the most logical build is, you might not be the only person with that lineup. You might be one of dozens of people with that lineup. So the types of things that it is okay to do is leave salary on the table. where you don't allocate your whole roster salary cap to your roster for your 5 players. There's a lot of ways to be different. Other ways to be different within that. I know this is like kind of a lot, but there's just, I think, broad topics to think about. Maybe we jump off into one of these. Again, it's more of a rolling discussion this week. But let's say you do build that lineup. It's got Saquon at MVP because he's great, right? And you don't think that Jalen Hurts, therefore, is in that perfect lineup, whatever it is. Maybe instead of just going with that obvious lineup with Saquon at MVP, you put Saquon at a flex and someone else at MVP in case Saquon's really good to great, but someone else is a little bit better. There are a lot of ways to build lineups. You don't have to play 4th string tight ends hoping that they score twice. A lot of ways to go. And final thing that I'll just say is, I know it's a tight spread, high total. If this one doesn't play that way, if one team plays from ahead, if this is a really low scoring game, you might see more kickers and defenses getting more fantasy points. So again, I know it's a lot to throw out, but really it's just a sort of different ways to think about how you should think about this. It's kind of easy in a way. It's really hard to get right because you only get one crack at it. But there's a lot of stuff that if you're interested in playing this slate, again, if this is overwhelming, don't worry. We got trends. We got stats. We'll get you covered. But if you're like, okay, I know fantasy, but I don't really get the single game stuff, those are the types of things to ask yourself.
Yeah, I want to go back to one point you mentioned, and that was all like good, very helpful stuff. I want to go back to one thing you mentioned, though, and that was being different, because you're going to have a lot more duplicated lineups in a single game slate than you will have for a full slate, because you've only got 5 players. Only one slot is where you can differentiate. And let's say you're in the big game bowl over on FanDuel. First place gets $1 million. Second place gets $50,000. Do you want to chop that million with someone else, or do you want it all to yourself? So like, yes, it's be different, but also be selfish. You want that million to yourself. And in order to do that, you got to find ways to be different. And like, yeah, it's fine. If you chop it, I'd still take, $1 million divided around a couple ways, but like, you want to be selfish here. You want that million to yourself. And the only way you're getting that is if you are taking active steps to be different from the field. And it does require, some work there, but it can be done. There will be unicorn lineups in that contest. So I think putting thought into it, I don't know, maybe is that the best way to put it? Putting thought into how to be different is something I would try to do. Frankly, going back to like your final point there, easiest way to put thought into it and be different is assume a different game script than what the betting odds say. Betting odds are a median expectation. That does not mean, that is what's going to happen. Check out the 85th percentile outcome. Check out the 95th. Check out the 15th percentile outcome for a team. You want to exploit that full range of outcomes, because most lineups in that contest are going to assume the betting odds are correct, because they typically are. But again, they are a median. They are not what is going to actually happen in reality necessarily in this game.
Yeah, and like they might be how it plays out, might play exactly that script, and that's okay. Like that's just, again, I'm not gonna like get into
costume
the multiverse
business
or anything, but like there are tens of thousands of ways this game could go, and it's going to go one way.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be really hard to get it exactly right and nail the optimal lineup. However, these teams have some concentrated usage, of course, to a degree. There are teams with more concentrated usage, but it's not bad. Now, you could say, I think this game scores 75 points, and therefore, both quarterbacks and Saquon Barkley are just going to go nuts, and you have to figure out other way. I mean, even that trio is hard to kind of navigate where you're not just throwing it away, but maybe it's both quarterbacks. And I'll try to remember to get into like some overall trends. Maybe that's where we go next. I'm not sure with what actually is in optimal lineups. Optimal lineups are helpful. They're not like the end all, because this is a Saquon Barkley game. Most games are not Saquon Barkley games. Saquon Barkley has a really high ceiling, so most running back trends may not apply to Saquon Barkley. But yeah, there's a lot of ways to go. And like you said, just thinking about how everyone's expecting this game to go and pivoting, like that Rams Patriots Super Bowl, right? Like It doesn't.
Yeah.
Like if you're willing to take a stand with maybe one of your lineups and you're like, you know what, I don't think there's a lot of touchdowns here, then you will benefit a lot if you're willing to take that risk.
Yeah, definitely. So let's talk about the single game trends you discussed, because I do think that kind of, again, we can provide the overall drop down and then dive into this game specifically. You've got trends based on the betting odds. And when you look at those are betting odds going in, it's not how the game played out. Betting odds going in to the game. And it says that kind of accounts for the fact that betting odds are not perfect. So when you look at past perfect lineups, what do you notice there as far as trends we can apply to potentially this game?
So there's I'm probably going to throw a lot of numbers out, but I'll try to take it slow and explain some stuff. But I have perfect lineups since FanDuel reconstructed things since 2022. And over the full sample of optimal lineups every game, the average salary, and I'm talking optimal lineups as in the best possible lineup, computer optimized after the game, cherry picking the best players, everything like that. The average salary spent is not that close to 60,000. It's actually 57,108. So on average, these are leaving a lot of salary on the table. Now, in games with spreads of 3.5 or lower, totals of at least 47.5, it's over 100 games in this sample. The average salary for these optimals is a bit higher, but it's still only 58,134. So roughly on average, you're leaving 2,000 on the table, which again is going to feel awkward if you don't build these lineups a lot. And it's not that you should always necessarily do that. If you, for example, fade Saquon Barkley or, potentially both quarterbacks, you don't have to do that as much because the quarterbacks and Saquon Barkley are going to be popular. So these are the types of things to think about. But if you compare games with similar scripts to this one leading in, a couple things are interesting. If you look at where I like to start with lineup construction and thinking about things is how many quarterbacks do I use, right? Is it a 0 quarterback lineup, 1 or 2? Those are very different constructions because those salaries are always high. 0 quarterback lineups happen about 11% of the time, which is flat with the full sample average. 1 quarterback lineups, though, are 49%, which is down from 58%. Most, the majority of perfect lineups have just 1 quarterback due to the fact that there's maybe not enough points scored. But in these higher scoring, tighter games, you see 2 quarterbacks make the perfect lineup 40% of the time, which is 10 points higher than the full average of 30%. So it's more likely than not, it's likelier than average a game like this has a 2 quarterback perfect lineup. But that also kind of, if you just plug in Saquon plus both quarterbacks, it's really hard to do that. So you have to ask yourself those questions. And I'm not going to get into every single thing off the bat because I think it's important to take it slow. But it never feels fun to play kickers and defenses, right? It doesn't feel as fun as playing these flex players. But games like this have a defense in the perfect lineup 26% of the time, which is down from 37% of the time. Has a kicker 37%, down from 40, so not as big of a drop because there's still points being scored. Field goals. I mean, 2 or 3 field goals is a pretty solid game, especially if there's extra points from those touchdowns. Now, if there's a kicker or a defense, that's 54% of the time, but that's also down from 63%, and basically 9% had a kicker and a defense, which is down from 14%. So defenses and kickers are less likely to be in the optimal lineup than across your full sample. But those are still relatively decent numbers. Again, 26% for a defense, 37% for a kicker. So don't just ignore those positions out of hand.
Yeah. So basically what you're saying is directionally, we are more likely to have 2 quarterbacks in the perfect lineup here than the average game. Still more likely to have 1 quarterback than 2, which is important to stress as well. And we are less likely to have kicker and defenses, but still, I think you said 54% to have at least one of those in the perfect lineup. And that's noteworthy. More than half the time, a kicker or a defense has been the perfect lineup in this kind of setup. So I think those are important things to keep in mind. Now, what about MVP trends in those games?
So MVPs are typically quarterbacks. Full sample, 35% of perfect lineups have a quarterback as the MVP, which is just basically another way of saying the highest scorer in the game. 29.5% for running back and 23.5% for wide receiver. This is a friendly script for quarterbacks where they see their average go up by about 3 percentage points to 38%, 38.4, and for wide receivers to 26.8%, which is still lower than running backs at 27.7%, which is a 2% or 2-point decrease. But it's still higher for running back. And again, there's a specific running back whose ceiling is not necessarily accounted for in these trends, but I do think it's helped.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. His ceiling of
10 points.
14.
Yeah. 40 yards and a touchdown is 10. That's where I got there.
Yeah. And then also for MVPs, MVPs are favored 55% of the time in this game environment. So 55% of the MVPs were favored, but it's actually 64% in the full split. So it's not that uncommon to see underdog MVPs in these games, these scripts with tighter spreads and higher totals. Now, I could get into the splits based on if the game plays lower scoring. I don't want to throw everything out there. Yeah. But basically, like I said at the start, if it does play, lower scoring, that's whenever you see things play more to the full trend. So if you take the inverse of what we said, more kickers, defenses, not a 2 QB lineup, probably more running back friendly, maybe including the Chiefs. They have 2 guys nobody really wants to play running backs in a timeshare, right? But if you think this one's lower scoring, that we'll call it 40 yards and a touchdown from Kareem Hunt could be enough. So you have to ask yourself every time why you're building the lineup you're building.
Yeah. And again, it's just kind of think of it like a 5-player parlay. For those of you transitioning from sports betting to DFS, it's a 5-player parlay, and you want those players to play well together, basically, within that. So I think those trends, good to keep in mind. So let's talk about the actual game at hand right now. That is the Chiefs and the Eagles right now, FanDuel Sportsbook. Chiefs favored by 1.5. Total this game has gone down a point, is now 48.5 versus 49.5 at open. Well, open 48.5, went up to 49.5, back down to 48.5. But pretty even splits between these two teams from a betting perspective, 50-50 on the percentage of bets and the spread. So I feel like we'll keep this pretty tight as far as where the things settle in on Sunday. But Brandon, what are your overall thoughts here? Chiefs versus Eagles down in New Orleans.
My data leans Eagles. It really likes their defense. My head just sort of says the Chiefs, but I do feel like this one is a little tricky to pinpoint, more toward the over. I think it's going to be tight. I don't really see this one being very lopsided as like my main expectation. Mm-hmm. I can see there cases for this one to be a bit like I don't want to say a runaway, but I can see how one team gets ahead, stays ahead a little bit. But my baseline is like, I think it's going to be tighter. Where I don't really have as good of a feel is if the Eagles are going to bleed the clock, if they're going to have that 9.5-minute opening drive, right. You go to the end of the first, it's maybe 3-0, 7-0, like maybe 0-0, first quarter splits in the Super Bowl are kind of a whole own discussion there. Or if the Chiefs just say, okay, we've been foot off the gas all season. Here's what we got. Saquon's ripping off plays. AJ Brown's coming to life because he's getting 35% of the targets every game. So while I think this one's closer, more often than not, I feel like I don't have as good of a feel in terms of how many points there's going to be. So what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I've got the Eagles favored by 0.55, total 49.5 for me. So pretty in line with the total here. I lean towards the Eagles, but like if I run my model and I take the Chiefs sample with Hollywood Brown, 4-game sample, which I can't reasonably say that's their relevant sample because like that's too small for me.
Yeah.
Got to regress that a bit. If I take that sample though, I got Chiefs by 2.7, total 52.5. So that's how good they've been with Hollywood Brown. So I'm pretty in line with market, I think, honestly, when it's all said and done, which is annoying. I like the games where I have a very different feel from what the market is saying, either from a total perspective or a spread perspective. But I do think the betting markets have this one pretty well pinned down personally.
How much does your model like the Eagles defense? Because that's a big part of it for me.
It likes them a lot, but also it doesn't really care about defense. I'm going to be honest. Like I could look up the weights, but it's not a defense doesn't matter. It's just defense matters a lot less approach.
Yeah.
To it. Yeah.
Totally makes
sense. But like
sense.
they're the top defense in my model.
Okay. That's again, it's the Chiefs. They have the ability to make that not matter as much. Yeah. But if we're getting a close game, I think neutral script kind of lets each team play like they want to play.
Yeah.
So what have you seen in these recent stats? We're going to talk relevant samples. Chiefs with Hollywood Brown. Yeah. There's like a 6-game sample for the Eagles where they've got their relevant pass catchers. Like where do you kind of want to start your lineups this week?
Yeah. So I think for me, it's starting with the MVP and kind of figuring it out from there. And it's like, okay, I want to start with, let's assume that let's say that Hollywood Brown split is correct. To me, that says Patrick Mahomes MVP in that assumption kind of lineup. Because if you look at the 4 games with Hollywood Brown in town, Mahomes has been the highest scoring player on the Chiefs in 3 of those 4 games, other one being Travis Kelce against the Texans in the divisional round. Overall, Mahomes, I looked at a 12-game sample of them since DeAndre Hopkins joined the team. He has been their highest scoring player 58% of the time. And if you look at the close wins, that jumps up to 80%. Now, they've only had 5 close wins in that time of 5 or fewer points. He's been the highest scoring player in 4 of those 5. Other one was Matthew Wright, who was the kicker when Harrison Butker was hurt. So like Mahomes spikes in close games because he's probably going to run more, frankly, if I had to guess. That's probably why. And also he's forced to throw for all 4 quarters, which is a positive for him too. So I kind of feel like I want to like make my assumption first and then build from there. And so that's why if I take the Hollywood Brown approach, Mahomes winds up being my MVP. Digging more into those splits as far as who's been the highest scoring player on each team in a couple different situations. Mentioned Mahomes 58% for the Chiefs in that 12-game sample with Hopkins. Travis Kelce's the only other guy with multiple. He's at 16.7%. Xavier Worthy once, DeAndre Hopkins once, and a kicker once. If you look at the wins by 5 or fewer, or by more than 5 points. So where the Chiefs have kind of controlled things by a decent amount. Mahomes is only 33% there. It's a 6-game sample, so twice. Travis Kelce twice, and then Worthy and Hopkins each once. Close wins, Mahomes 4 out of 5, kicker once, and then in their one loss to the Bills, it was also Mahomes there. So I think if you assume tight script, Patrick Mahomes' value increases, which is weird, given I think the Eagles are kind of the opposite. If you look at them, 14-game sample with A.J. Brown and Jalen Hurts. In those, overall, Saquon Barkley has been the highest scoring player 57% of the time. Jalen Hurts, 36%, A.J. Brown, 7%. But when they win big, Hurts' split goes up to 50%. It's a 10-game sample versus Saquon at 50%. And this makes sense because Jalen Hurts scores touchdowns in those games. If they win by more points, they got to score more points. And who has scored 31% of the Eagles' touchdowns this year in the games he's played? It's Jalen Hurts. So I think I just kind of want to like pick the script and allow that to pick my MVP. If I assume Eagles win, kind of running away, Jalen Hurts MVP. If I assume tight script Chiefs win, Patrick Mahomes MVP. If I assume tight script Eagles win, Saquon Barkley MVP. And I would put Saquon Barkley at MVP in some scripts where it's a tight game, but the Chiefs win as well. So that's kind of the way I'm viewing MVP for this week, is making my, okay, how does this game play out? And then picking MVP and then going from there.
Yeah. I mean, this is clearly the big 3.
Yeah.
They're salaried as such, although A.J. Brown's salary compared to Jalen Hurts is really interesting because it's only a $1,000 difference. And I love AJ Brown.
Yeah.
But again, this is where things get a little tricky and probably roundabout and probably feels a little exhaustive. But yeah, baseline Jalen Hurts clears AJ Brown by a ton. There are going to be instances where AJ Brown outscores Jalen Hurts in certain game scripts, right? But it does make it really difficult to enter this one thinking about pivoting off of those three at MVP in most instances outside of massive tournaments, right? Like that's the caveat here. Nobody yell. We know that there are chances that AJ Brown is the top scorer.
Yeah.
In fact, my simulation model has it about 6% of the time that AJ Brown.
Talk me through the rest of that. What are the odds to the other players in that?
I've got Jalen Hurts around 32%.
Okay.
Mahomes around 28%.
Okay.
And Saquon around 22%.
Okay.
Which might feel low.
Sure.
But it is based on a lot of things. And you're also kind of factoring in with Saquon an elevated salary.
Yeah.
And you like that's part of it. But effectively, if I were just picking sort of more blindly, not letting like the model do the talking, I would want sort of those numbers to look a little closer.
Sure.
But that's not necessarily unfair, or that's also not necessarily fair to Jalen Hurts, who literally has, I think he has no ceiling with his touchdowns because it's however many red zone trips he has, that's his ceiling for rushing touchdowns. If we're just being
10
honest.
carries, 16 yards, 3 touchdowns in the conference championship. He's Jerome Bettis at quarterback.
It's absurd in this fact that his salary is third. And look, Mahomes is running more. He's got 7 and 11 carries in the playoffs. 43 yards last week rushing, 14 the week before, but there's 2 rushing touchdowns against Buffalo. I get it. But Jalen Hurts, on a full slate, he always is like, for us, we like him, but the passing's not really there. This is one iteration of a specific game.
Right.
If Jalen Hurts scores 3 times, yeah, maybe there's a chance that Saquon does sort of outscore him somehow, but it's not very likely. And we shouldn't be astonished if Jalen Hurts scores multiple times. In fact, it's one of your favorite angles to this game is for Jalen Hurts potentially to score multiple times. So I think, yes, those 3 rightly deserve to be in the MVP conversation with nobody else particularly close. Again, from a main process standpoint, but Hurts to me, like my model says, he's the most likely to lead. He's the lowest salaried. I think he's like the least fun to put at MVP, honestly, out of the 3.
Yeah.
So he's kind of my preferred way to be different out of those top 3. Any like additional thoughts on Hurts? Yeah. I know you talked about him a bit.
Yeah.
But is he close to Saquon for you in terms of MVP allocation?
Yeah, definitely. Because I think you think about it like I was talking about the baseline rates of like guys and like the baseline thought process, but also think about like this psychologically. What have we done throughout the entire playoffs? We have watched Saquon Barkley rip off long run after long run, and you're filling out a lineup on Sunday afternoon. Game's about to kick off. You're like, let's put in some lineups. You're like, well, I got to put Saquon at MVP because like Saquon been going nuclear. You've talked about this for PGA, but the golfer with the highest salary tends to be the golfer with the highest roster rate. Saquon Barkley, highest roster, likely to be MVP as a result. So if we talk about like a roster rated MVP specifically versus your simulations, I think Saquon Barkley is probably a bit over rostered at MVP relative to where he probably should be. And that doesn't mean I'll know Saquon Barkley, but I'm comfortable kind of like playing things similar to what your simulations have, where it's like, okay, I'm okay putting Saquon Barkley in there. Was it 26% of the time or 22%?
It was like 22, but
yes, I'm okay putting him in there 22%. I'll be below the field, but I still got some. Like 22% is not nothing, and I can run with that and feel pretty good about that. So for me personally, I think if I got one lineup for this thing, I'm putting a quarterback there just to be determined which guy that is. If I think, again, If I think that Mahomes has that Hollywood Brown split where he's been the second best quarterback in football efficiency wise behind Lamar Jackson, then I'm putting Mahomes at MVP. If I think no, I think the model's right. I think the Eagles offense is specifically the thing that's underrated in my model. Eagles offense, once you factor in the Chiefs defense, I think being a bit overrated, then I put Hurts in there. So you give me one lineup, I'm probably going to have a quarterback in there. I lean towards Hurts, but it's a lean more than anything else.
So I think hopefully it's clear where we are with these top three. If you're building one lineup again in a smaller tournament or against some friends or head to heads, I think these are the three realistic options. But outside of that, who's the first name you're looking to in these potentially large field tournaments where you want to get different? Or option B, one of the first three names that we discussed at MVP and just saving more salary. Does anybody come close to MVP consideration for you outside of Saquon, Mahomes, and Hurts?
I think the guy who comes most to mind is AJ Brown, given that we've seen it. We've seen him have games where he goes for 30 FanDuel points. We haven't seen it in a while. I guess we haven't seen it this year, but like we have seen it at times because he can get you 100 yards and 2 touchdowns, and that might be enough. Again, going back to the split where 14 games with him and Hurts, he was only in there at MVP once. But you look back to last year, that stuff still matters too. We can't just look at a small sample and say, okay, that's what the baseline should be. I think that he's the guy most likely to have like kind of a nuclear sort of game. So thought there is AJ Brown. It probably should be Travis Kelce number 2, just because like the playoff Kelce narrative. Like, I guess the way I'm thinking about it is it's one of these three is like the alternative option, AJ Brown, Travis Kelce, Xavier Worthy. But like, I feel best about Brown, and I'm not sure, like, I don't know. The other guys are kind of tough for me. How do you settle in for the non-big three at MVP?
Yeah, I mean, AJ Brown's the most obvious name.
Yeah.
If you look at a 6-game sample where this team has had AJ Brown, Dallas Goedert, and Devontae Smith, AJ Brown's single game target shares have been 35%, 35%, 32, 17, 35, and 33. So in the playoffs, the last 2 weeks, we'll say specifically, because he did have a 17% share against the Packers, but 35 and 33%. If you are of the mindset that the Chiefs play from ahead a bit and we see additional passing volume, or we just see additional passing volume from the Eagles to be different and throw some different stuff out there, this team has told us that AJ Brown is their wide receiver 1 by a mile. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that Dallas Goedert's target shares have actually been pretty stellar. In his 3 playoff games, it's 33%, 20%, and 33%. And then you drop off to Devontae Smith, who's around like 20%. I mean, he's still got upside, but he's not treated the same way, which again, doesn't mean he can't be MVP. There's a pretty specific game script where Devontae Smith is MVP, where the Chiefs sell out to stop everybody and leave Devontae. He's a good enough player to make them pay for that. But it's AJ Brown, I think, first and foremost. Where I would go next, despite like the Travis Kelce playoff narrative, I get it, would I think be to Xavier Worthy because of his red zone involvement.
Yeah.
If you just look, this team has had, like, this year we've had Rashee Rice be a game changer. It feels like 3 years ago at this point, but that was this season. They got DeAndre Hopkins. Recently they added Hollywood Brown. You could look at it. I would understand looking at a ton of different splits, but if we just look at this team in the playoffs with like, look, here's what we got the rest of the way. And then you go to the playoffs, Worthy's got a 27% target share. He's got 45% of the red zone targets. And in terms of the money targets, so if he's inside the 10 or in the end zone when he's actually targeted, he's got half of those. He's getting targeted on 29% of his routes, which is basically the cutoff for elite. I say it's 30% for simplicity, but he's right up there with Travis Kelce in terms of target per route rate. He can get used in a lot of different ways. He does have upside, and he's like a really natural fit for, okay, Xavier Worthy had like 110 scrimmage yards and scored twice in a lower scoring game. He was the best player. It's within reason. Can't stress enough. It's not the first way we're thinking about stuff. That's the top three, the three big dogs. But Worthy, I think, is probably going to be a little more overlooked than Travis Kelce in the Super Bowl. Could be wrong in that, but there's a lot to like about Worthy. But I do think that those three are the next tier. And as much as I understand a case for Devontae Smith or even Dallas Goedert, I don't really know how many MVP lineups I'm going to put those guys in. If I'm getting off the wall, it might be more of like a defense MVP in case there's some sort of like absurdity in a really low scoring game. But again, I think these three are the next tier for sure.
I'm with you on the thoughts on Worthy. I have a different sample. I have 4 games with Hollywood Brown. So just, slightly different, but even in that sample, 26% target share for Worthy, 29% of the deep targets, and a 41% red zone share. In that 4-game sample, he has 11 red zone targets and 4 red zone rush attempts, which are not included in that target share. So like, that's an absurd number. So I talked before about the lineup where, if I assume that the Hollywood Brown sample is like the legit expectations for the Chiefs, Xavier Worthy's in that lineup. Mahomes probably going to be MVP, but it's Mahomes, the first guy I lock in, Xavier Worthy, number 2, because of how good his target shares have been. And like, yeah, you're right. I probably should put him above Kelce too, just because people are going to think more about Kelce given everything for this game. So relative to roster rate, Xavier Worthy probably the better MVP option. I think I do agree with you there.
So I've also run, this is where it gets tricky to break down a game like this, because there's so many things to get into, talking about like, AJ Brown's had better splits against teams that run a lot of man coverage, but how does that really, like, it's the fact that he's getting the targets that I care about more, like the target shares, I'll say. But I have run correlation matrices for these teams. If you look at the full season among relevant players, Xavier Worthy and Patrick Mahomes have the highest correlation between one another. But if you look at that 4-game sample with Hollywood Brown, which I know is really small, it's basically a perfect correlation between these two. Like in the divisional round, they both kind of had like weaker games, but when Mahomes has spiked, so has Worthy. I think if we're talking like main pivots to MVP, what we're really also talking about is like preferred flex plays. I really like Xavier Worthy as a primary flex play. Honestly, with any MVP, that could be Saquon, that could be even Jalen Hurts, but especially, I don't know how many lineups I'm going to build with Mahomes at MVP and not have Xavier Worthy. So
I think that like you're talking about this from an overall flex perspective. I like him more there than I do in the MVP discussion, and I liked him in the MVP.
Absolutely,
but like, because I think that AJ Brown has the higher true ceiling than Xavier Worthy, which is why I mentioned him first. But if we're talking like just a regular flex player, like my expectations probably gonna be a little bit higher for Xavier Worthy. As you consider, $1,000 in salary goes a long way for this contest. So that's why to me, Worthy at 11.5, I like him more than Kelce for that flex spot. I like him more than Brown as well. I think he's phenomenal because of the rushing, because he's just kind of turned into like a legitimate wide receiver somehow over the past couple of games, and I think that's fascinating. So I really do like him a lot. So MVP, most of the big 3 considerations: AJ Brown, Travis Kelce, Xavier Worthy. Leaning towards Brown 1, but then you talked me into Worthy number 2 there. So let's talk about this from a flex perspective. And if we like Barkley, Mahomes, Hurts, et cetera, let's say you've got one of them at MVP. Let's say you got Hurts there. Are you jamming in a second pair or person from the big 3, or are you letting the rest of your roster dictate if you get back up there?
So that's where things get really interesting, especially if you plug in Saquon first, because the salary's even more elevated. If you try to get in even, and again, it's a very specific game environment where you go with Jalen Hurts. So Jim's doing Barkley, Hurts, and Mahomes. It gets tight quickly.
Yeah.
I don't even know.
Like, just one quick interjection here is that, so you have 8,000 left on a typical single game slate. I'd be like, yeah, that's fine. I can do that. Salaries are real tight for this week.
They are.
Like the lowest guy, I'm like, yeah, I can see it, is Juju Smith-Schuster, whose salary is $7,000. I thought he'd be 6,000. So salaries are tight for this week, and that does psychologically play a pretty big role. Like Isaiah Pacheco's 85. Why? Like, FanDuel did not make this easy on you to roster all three guys, which kudos to them. It should be tough, but it ain't easy, man.
So that's basically the big thing here. But even if you go with, it's 500, I get it. But if you go with Barkley and Hurts, you're still kind of stretched thin. Now you're assuming a pretty almost no passing touchdowns here. That's just all rushing touchdowns. So you probably don't want to get to, and this is, I think, helpful if anyone's still kind of trying to get the light bulb or the ignition to turn over or something. I know so much about cars. I know more about cars probably than electricity, so I switched my metaphor here. But if you start off with this combo, if you're trying to plug in like Dallas Goedert, you're really saying there's 5 touchdowns, 2 passing, both go to Goddard, and Barkley gets 2 and Hurts rushes for the other one or something like that. That's how you need to think about things. So you can't just necessarily plug in a value receiver for the Eagles. Again, you can, but you got to think about that stuff. Even this start, though, it gets pretty tricky for 10,000 left. Now, the other thing here, and I'll kind of let it simmer from there. We're talking about leaving salary on the table, right? But a Saquon Hurts combo isn't going to be that common because it doesn't make a ton of sense from a baseline standpoint, but in certain game scripts, it makes a lot of sense, right? So if this is my start, I'm not necessarily thinking I need to leave a ton of salary on the table, because this combo in particular is a little more unique than Saquon Mahomes,
right?
Which makes a lot more sense. You say, okay, Saquon's going to get the rushing, not Hurts. I'm going to go Mahomes. So, but even this, it gets a little tricky. Just kind of shout out, don't forget those kickers and defenses.
Yes, that does help. Jake Elliott's salary 9,000. Harrison Butker also there. Defenses, Eagles are at 8,000. Chiefs 8,000 as well. One thing you did mention is the sliding scale of being different. The sliding scale of how much salary to leave on the table. We talked about AJ Brown, Travis Kelce, Xavier Worthy. If you do that at MVP, I'd still leave some on the table, but you're talking $500 as opposed to $1,500 minimum kind of thing. So it does get a lot easier in that regard. I just, it is a thinner route for sure. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm with you though. We're going to have to get to the true values eventually. Yeah. We're kind of skipping over and we'll jump back up. There's not a lot of lowest salary plays who are really involved. And I think it's probably a good time to have that conversation of, does it take just one to make a perfect lineup? It depends on the game environment. If this game scores 65 points and you have someone with an 8-yard touchdown, it's still probably not going to be enough.
Right. It depends on how concentrated those touchdowns are. If it's the conference championship game where Saquon Barkley and Jalen Hurts both have 3 touchdowns, you got to find a way. And it could be just one. I mean, there was Will Shipley, but that's not going to happen again, most likely. But it depends on how concentrated that is. And I think that for this game specifically, given how concentrated things are on the Eagles, I think that you're more okay with chasing a scrub than you would be in some other situation, just because things are very concentrated, at least for one team in this game.
Chasing with a quaternary ancillary Eagle?
No, probably with the Chief.
That's what I wanted to clarify.
Yeah. So when I'm talking about that, I don't think Juju Smith-Schuster counts in this discussion. I don't count him as being an ancillary jabroni. Shout out Rich Rebar. Because he ran 18 routes in the conference championship. I think he's an actual good play at 7,000. But if we're talking about Jahan Dotson, $7,000, that's thin desperation play. Justin Watson, That's a thin desperation play. Samaje Perine, $6,500. All these guys down here are, you're living on a hope and a prayer. I'm okay with taking some swipes at that just because things are pretty concentrated on the Eagles side of things with Saquon, with Hurts, and things like that.
I will just say, and there's a lot more that goes into this, looking at a larger sample, but I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with looking at the conference championship game and trying to glean some information. I'm just going to rattle off the route rate leaders from not last week, but the last game. AJ Brown at 91%, Devontae Smith 85%. Let me throw in tight ends here. All right. It's not working, Jim. I should have been on top of this. All right, I'm just gonna do receivers though. Yeah. All right, 91% for AJ Brown, 85% for Devontae Smith, 83% for Xavier Worthy, 67% for Marquise Brown, 59% for Juju Smith-Schuster, and 56% for Jahan Dotson, who you did besmirch a little bit, but then it's a drop off. Then it's a drop
accurate.
off.
In the sample with everyone healthy, his target share is 4%. I did not besmirch
I understand.
him.
I know.
As someone who has a lot of Jahan Dotson in Dynasty, I think I'm allowed to say this.
That's fair. But my point with that was it was sort of to supplement what you were saying. There's not a lot of like extra guys who are getting run that's relevant. Now, if a Noah Gray scores or he gets more involved, that's great. That's awesome. But in reality, we are looking at two teams and in the Super Bowl where there's not going to be a ton additional, sort of to go around. Like fewer scraps to go around, I think is something that's important to keep in mind.
Which is why I feel like I'm just going to wind up having an F ton of Juju Smith-Schuster in this game at $7,000 because you mentioned the route rate, 59% during the conference championship. He looked good, but also he's looked good at other times this year. Remember before they made the Hopkins trade, he had that one game where he went bananas, 7 for 130 against the Saints, then hurt his hamstring immediately after that and like kind of became irrelevant. And then suddenly they're like, oh, I guess we have Juju again. $7,000 goes a long way. So let's go back to that build. We've got Saquon Barkley, Jalen Hurts, Juju Smith-Schuster at $7,000. After you do that, 11.5 left per player, sick. So if we're talking about players most likely to be, if I have a single bullet lineup, the player most likely to be in that lineup very well might be Juju Smith-Schuster because he's not really dependent on game script. I might just need to use him, honestly. And so like, I know that sounds wild and he would not be my highest rostered, most heavily rostered guy, but the player most likely to be in a single lineup of mine, honestly, might be Juju Smith-Schuster.
Yeah. And we're not going to go through and necessarily like build full lineups or anything, but I would assume you're not alone in that. And I would also assume that a Saquon, Mahomes...
I don't know if people know that Juju ran that many routes in the conference championship. Because like you look at his betting odds at FanDuel Sportsbook for like his props, I think he's at like 13.5 receiving yards is his prop. I'm trying to scroll through. They changed the navigation for Super Bowl and I always had to like find the right tabs for everything. And so it's like, I don't know where to find like my typical stuff, but like his prop is really low. I don't know how popular he's going to be.
That's fair.
Actually, it's up to 16.5. I think people figured it out. I think it was 13.5. So people are on Juju. So if I want to buy into Juju, I should probably do so. I probably should have done so Tuesday, but I did not.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm seeing some of his other projections pretty lower than I would have expected. So
yeah.
But no, I think a Saquon, Mahomes, Juju start. What I was kind of getting at is that's what I think is the most logical start if I'm trying to build the best possible lineup.
Yeah, I think so too.
At least as of Thursday, maybe I pivot that to Hurts and get an Eagles pass catcher, but there's just not a lot of additional help in that.
Yeah,
I mean, if you go from Juju, we talked Dotson, who's might get some routes, and I can't believe I didn't think of this workaround, but I got the tight end routes from last week. It was very simple. But Noah Gray and Grant Calcaterra were around 42% of the routes as well. Not necessarily saying that they're going to get a lot of targets or high leverage targets necessarily, but there's not a whole lot.
Yeah.
So I know we're doing this like a little backwards.
Yeah.
But
no, I think it's right.
Who above Juju? Because I don't think there's anyone below. Again, we talked Dotson at
I think
7,
we should at least talk below. Like, let's give it some lip service. Is there anybody else you're like, you're not going to vomit if they're in your lineup? Like, I'll have an occasional Jahan Dotson. Samaje Perine, if you look at him in the games since Isaiah Pacheco returned, he's at 20 receiving yards per game. That's not nothing. 4% red zone share. So it's like, it ain't great, but like, maybe it could pay off at $6,500. He'll get some pass catching and stuff like that. I think Samaje Perine's probably the lowest I can realistically go.
Yeah, like Grant Calcaterra doesn't earn targets, but actually, I could see.
We assume Nico Remigio gets a kickoff return touchdown, double dip with the Chiefs defense. There we go. Now we're talking.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's probably, it's kind of there's not a lot. Again, Grant Calcaterra is going to play snaps. He's going to run a couple routes, but he's not going to get a lot of targets. If you say, look, I'm having Jalen Hurts as my MVP. I think he throws a strange touchdown to Calcaterra. Congrats. You could do a lot worse.
Sure.
But you could also probably do a lot better.
The one guy I want to say, there are two guys who I'm like actively low on in this range. Those guys are Noah Gray at 75 and DeAndre Hopkins at 85. And it's because of the roles they've had recently. Obviously, Hopkins has not had an amazing role. Didn't run a whole lot of routes in the conference championship game. And again, I think that's probably going to be our best sample of like what they want to do. 9 routes there for DeAndre Hopkins. Gray ran 3. So he had like a legit role earlier on when they had no receivers, but they've actually got receivers now. So the players I'm lower on down here, Noah Gray 75 and DeAndre Hopkins 85. Players I'm actively high on, Juju Smith-Schuster, and then it's probably looking at the defenses as far as like, low salary plays I feel somewhat okay about for this one. And Justin Watson could catch a 60-yard touchdown, so it's like there is that too. But yeah, odds of that are not super, super high.
So what I think we're talking ourselves into is that it's very difficult to go with 2 of the 3 studs unless you're playing Juju or a kicker or defense.
Yeah, which I'm going to do. I think it's worth it to play those 2 in order. Yeah. Yep. Okay.
So who you don't like Hopkins?
Yep.
I don't see it with Pacheco.
I agree.
Again, in specific game scripts.
Yeah.
If he were to score, although Hunt's more involved in the red zone.
Correct.
It's not outrageous, but again, process-wise, not super smart. We talked kickers. What are you seeing with the name above the kickers with Hollywood Brown?
I like him a lot. So I actually like this entire mid-range from a flex perspective, beginning with Xavier Worthy at 11.5, going down to Hollywood Brown at 95. I think all those guys are awesome. So it's like, what?
Yeah, okay. I'm going to ask you about someone in particular then.
Who?
You know who? Come on.
Kareem Hunt?
Yeah.
Oh, well, we'll get to that. But like, I like Hollywood Brown more. $9,500 for Hollywood Brown. If you look at his like production in the games that he has played, it ain't doing a whole lot for you. No more than 45 yards in a single game. But the usage has been pretty good. 17% target share for him and a 43% deep target share. But he and Mahomes are 0 for 6 on those deep balls. You're telling me Pat Mahomes in a dome can hook up with Hollywood Brown a couple times on a deep ball? I think he can. So I prefer Worthy. Worthy is the better usage. His salary's fine. I'm okay with both though, because if you do both, like that is a 48% target share, 43% target share in the sample. And you're also getting 71% deep target share. Now, Vic Fangio doesn't let up deep balls. Like that's his MO as a defensive coordinator. So it's like, got to consider that too. But like, I'm cool with having both Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy in the same lineup. So honestly, I feel like the vibe I'm getting from myself is that I like a lot of the Chiefs receivers. I like Xavier Worthy 11.5, like Hollywood Brown 95, like Juju 7,000. So I feel okay turning to those guys because I think they're all fine relative to their salary based on the roles they've had recently.
Yeah, I agree. I think the Chiefs, just in general, like they're more single game friendly because there's more names to pick from, but the Eagles are more desirable because the target shares are great. So I guess not including kickers and defenses, there's Hurts, Saquon, and the 3 pass catchers. So there's like 5 guys that you consider playing.
Yeah. Basically.
The Chiefs, you start to sprinkle in a couple more. Again, to a certain degree, both running backs are in play.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going to stick with the Chiefs here, and I want to hear you talk about Kareem Hunt and where you are.
So I think it depends on how you assume things break down from the backfield perspective. In the conference championship, he had 17 carries and a target. Against the Texans, 8 carries and 1 target. And I think he's looked good enough where that's probably going to stick. So it's in part because I'm low on Pacheco that I like Kareem Hunt. Just because, again, the red zone share has been pretty good. It's not amazing when you look at like the share for him, but like he's getting work. He's looked pretty good. Seems like they like him. So I'm going to prefer guys around him. Like I prefer Dallas Goedert, prefer Hollywood Brown. But like, let's say I've got those guys in my lineup already and I've got 12,000 left. I'm fine going Kareem Hunt to leave 1.5K on the table in that scenario. So it's because I think his role will stick that I'm comfortable with him, despite the fact I don't think he has a good ceiling.
Yeah, it's he's like the prototypical here. How do you think this game goes?
Yeah.
If you think his 60 yards and a touchdown is enough, you're probably not super high on this game overall. But that's also not fair because double-digit FanDuel points at a salary like this is very single lineup friendly or single game optimal lineup friendly. So I'm with you where I much prefer Hunt over Pacheco to the point that Pacheco is going to be like a desperation play.
Yeah.
And I think we're kind of like in lockstep with how we view the Chiefs overall.
Yeah.
And really all that's left to me, I'm not really going to dig into like defenses and kickers to that degree, are Devontae Smith and Dallas Goedert.
Yep. So if you look at the games they've played together, the 6 games with everyone together, so omitting the games A.J. Brown missed, get Dallas Goedert missed, stuff like that. Mentioned before, 32% target share for A.J. Brown. Goddard's actually second at 23%. Devontae Smith is at 21%. Devontae Smith does have the edge in deep targets, 23% to 14%, but then Goddard is the edge in red zone targets, 24% to 12%. So like from a baseline, I prefer Goddard. I think everyone will prefer Goddard though. So if I had to use Goddard in order to leave money on the table, I'll use Goddard. That's fine. I'd rather leave salary on the table and use Goddard than pivot. But like, let's say I've got, wiggle room to use Devontae Smith in order to be different without being dumb. I'm fine with that. So I prefer Goddard as a baseline. I think he is the better straight up play. But I also think that'll be the consensus on these guys is that Goddard's a better play. We just saw him stiff arm a dude into oblivion recently. And he's had the better playoff run. So it's like, I think that's why Goddard's the better play. Smith is a better like pivot if I can get there in terms of salary.
So I think these two guys are pretty integral into what our mantra really is for this show, which is when you're playing DFS, being different without being dumb about how you do it.
Yeah.
If you play a Jalen Hurts MVP lineup with Smith and Goddard, you're getting access to 2 elevated pass catchers with ceilings. Devontae Smith has some yardage upside, even if he hasn't shown it a lot. Dallas Goedert has yardage and touchdown equity. You have a lot of freedom to kind of play obvious names. Yeah, you're not getting Saquon. but as Jim's doing, you could play Mahomes in this lineup. You're not getting to AJ Brown, but ask yourself, like, is it realistic that Jalen Hurts has a huge game, steals all the rushing scores? AJ Brown isn't erupting, but Jalen Hurts is effective as a passer, and Devontae Smith and Dallas Goedert are doing stuff. Like, that's kind of how simple it can be. I'm not saying that this is the optimal way to sort of say, to step outside your comfort zone. You're like, I'm just going to do this. This is how it's going to play out.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily that hard to do something that's not, it doesn't feel right not to have Saquon. Doesn't feel right to have Hurts without AJ Brown. But this is a really simple way to give yourself a different look and at least start thinking about the game a different way.
Yeah, I agree with that. Because like you said, it's a very easy assumption to make. And like if I assume that this happens where Hurts is getting there via passing, I assume Mahomes is doing stuff on the other side. So it's also like I can easily put in the other side of this game too. You have 11-5 left on the table for one slot. That's sick. Like that's an easy line to build. That's one like you like to do the thing where you build a lineup, duplicate it, make small swaps. I could do that with this, like put in Mahomes at MVP, put in Hurts at MVP, put in Marquise Brown or put in Hollywood Brown. I put in Juju and leave like $4,500 on the table if it's a big enough contest. Like that's fine too. Put in a kicker, put in Harrison Butker.
Sure.
You got a lot of options for this lineup to duplicate it and do that. So I do think that's a smart way to think about things. I want to ask you now to rank the mid-range. Let's lop off AJ Brown, lop off Kelsey. So we're talking Xavier Worthy 11-5 down through, let's go Marquise Brown at 95. So it's Worthy 11-5, Devontae Smith 11,000, Kareem Hunt 10-5, Goddard 10,000, Hollywood Brown $9,500. How are you ranking that tier of players?
Worthy. Smith.
Okay. Considering salary?
Yeah.
Okay. I think when you consider roster rate, I agree with you.
Worthy, Smith, Hunt, Goddard. Is it just in order maybe for me?
Potentially.
What about you?
Which is fine. I think that's probably, I don't know. I might be a little bit lower on Hunt. I think I like Goddard more than Hunt. But like, should I? Because like their yards and scrimmage projections are probably similar. And Hunt is, I mean, like you took look at FanDuel odds, Hunt is more likely to score. So I probably should be higher on Hunt, I guess. To be specific, Kareem Hunt's anytime touchdown odds at FanDuel Sportsbook plus 150, Devontae Smith plus 230, Goddard plus 310. So I guess probably I should be higher on Kareem Hunt there.
Hunt's also plus 1,000 for 2+ touchdowns with Worthy at plus 1,100. But
yeah,
I would say, well, I might go Worthy, Hunt, Smith, Goddard, Brown. I like Brown, but I like the role more than the production.
Yeah.
And I know that there's potential there, but again, I don't think Kareem Hunt's going to, if this is just an Isaiah Pacheco game, it's going to be a surprise. It's not really going to be what they've been telling us they want to do. And that can happen.
Yeah.
But I think this is a solid mid-range. And I think the fact that I'm not substantially higher on anyone other than Worthy, who I have pretty high, in a tier of his own.
Yeah, I agree.
I think it gives me some flexibility. And it does make those lineups where you don't dip below Hollywood Brown at 95 and you're just finding ways to do it. They're kind of fun.
Yeah, I mean, I built that lineup before with it was the Mahomes, Hurts, Goddard, and Smith lineup. Hollywood Brown at 95 leaves you 2K on the table, I believe, in that lineup. Like that's sweet. Like that's no one below that mark. And I like Juju, but I think that's a fine way to build for sure.
So I think it's appealing. But yeah, I would say kind of to simplify it, really elevate touchdown odds. Like there's only so many touchdowns that can go around.
Yeah.
Touchdown odds, I think, are really important. Obviously, touchdowns important in all fantasy, but when you're talking single game, looking at like multi-touchdown upside. That stuff matters. So be receptive to it. On a full slate, we're not big Kareem Hunt guys. If he's 4th in odds to score twice, that's relevant.
Yeah. And I don't think that's wrong either, given his red zone role. I think that the odds makers had that correct. Okay. I give you one lineup. What's the build? You don't need to tell me who's in it, but like, what's the build for that lineup? Are you looking to go where you just pepper that mid range and stay above Hollywood Brown and above?
What am I entering?
What's that?
What am I
big
entering?
Contest? Because that's what everyone's
big contest.
Big contest.
Probably a Jalen Hurts MVP.
Okay.
With some semblance of, in that case, I might go Hurts, Brown, Goddard, and use Juju.
Which Brown?
Oh, sorry, AJ Brown.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
We can maybe figure it out from there.
Yeah, I think that works. I think for me, if I have one lineup, I'm inclined to go double quarterback with Hurts and Mahomes. And then
me too.
Peppering. Yeah, I know. Peppering this mid-range. I think that's pretty attractive. I will have lineups where I go with all three of the big three, but I think the overall takeaway here is we're both receptive to not having Saquon if we have a single lineup, which is frightening. It is not enjoyable, but I think it's like something we have to be open to for sure.
You just got to ask yourself, like, okay, if you're that worried about Saquon though, like if that's your baseline assumption, is it worth kind of punting with two ancillary guys or not saving any salary potentially to get to Saquon? Plus maybe
if you use Juju,
something like
you can pepper that mid-range we like. But it's dependent on using him. You could use a defense too. Like you could use a kicker. But like versus a non-Saquon lineup, you can avoid all the sketchy value entirely.
I'm okay with Juju. Let's not call him non-sketchy though.
Fair.
Because the thing here,
sketch Schuster,
it's really easy to give we talk about concessions all the time when we talk golf, when we're building lineups. You can't really afford a concession that fails. And by can't really, I just mean you can't. If Juju gets 2 targets and has like 7 yards and he's in a lot of your lineups, you're toast. Now,
like we're hyping up based on his conference championship usage where he had 3 targets. So you're not even deviating from the baseline hardly at all.
So I'm just saying, like, yes, out of the true values, he does have the best case, but it's really easy to say, well, I'll just keep plugging in Juju and therefore I can play like 4 other guys I like. You kind of need to elevate your median expectation, not because you're building lineups based on your median expectation, but if your median expectation for Juju is like 2.5 targets, he shouldn't be someone you have a lot of exposure to.
Correct.
So, but in that big tournament that you asked me about, he makes sense.
Sure. Yep.
If we were playing a head-to-head against one another, he ain't in it.
If we're playing a head-to-head, I might have the big 3 in there and put Juju in there, frankly. I might be okay with that. Just because like the baseline for those 3 is sick.
Yeah, I think other players have relatively sick baselines though too, but not quite on their level. So I get it.
Okay. Any final thoughts for you on Super Bowl 59 from a DFS perspective?
I can just now envision. I see this sometimes about like envisioning the end of the first quarter, like Chiron coming up, and it's 0-0 in this big game. I kind of can envision like, and Kareem Hunt punches in his second touchdown, and it's like, well, that tracks. Like,
but like, I don't think we should be disappointed because we're actually okay with him.
So I know.
For once, we're cool with it.
Yeah, but I get like mental pictures in my head sometimes about these games. That feels kind of likely.
Yeah.
And overall, what I'm getting at is you're going to have everyone's going over very similar data, talking about the same thing, talking about the same 12 players. If you have an instinct, unless it's like, Nico
Remigio.
Chiefs double stacks as your baseline, maybe check yourself, but nobody really knows how this thing's going to play out. So if you have thoughts, if you see something, single game that's I think the most fun part of single game is you get to sort of justify saying like, I'm going to plant my flag in this role player or that this game's going this way. And if it does, that's where you stand to benefit. So I love single game.
Yeah.
It's very fun. And I think this is the time to take a stand if you see one.
If you really want to take a stand with Nico Remigio like that, just bet him to score an anytime touchdown, 44-1 at FanDuel.
That's also fair.
Like, just do that. I think that's another route we could take there. Okay. That is all that we have here for today and this season on the NFL side of things for the Heat Check. Brandon, appreciate you as always. Fun year, but still got some PGA. So I'm excited to talk to you about that throughout the offseason, but fun ride with you as always.
Yeah. It feels weird signing off for the year, but we got PGA coming. We got some other stuff potentially for NFL.
Yep.
So it won't be that long. It won't be as long as normal, I think.
Yes, we will still be here throughout the offseason on the FanDuel Football Betting YouTube page, talking about some fun stuff over there. So be sure to subscribe to that FanDuel Football Betting YouTube page. Also, because later today, talking some player props with Dr. Ed Feng and Megan Payton of FanDuel TV. They'll be swinging by talking about their top props for Sunday's game. That is 2 p.m. Eastern on the YouTube page. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Annie Nader will join me to talk some novelty props and other player props she likes as well for this game. So a lot of reasons to still check out the FanDuel Football Betting YouTube page. Leave us a thumbs up there and make sure to subscribe there as well and turn on notifications. The golf show will be on the FanDuel Golf Betting YouTube page, but also on the FanDuel Research Podcast feed. Brandon, people have questions for you on social media. Where can they find you there?
I'm on X at Gdula13, GDULA13, and on Blue Sky at Gdula.
And I am on both X and Blue Sky at JimSannes. You can find FanDuel Research on X at FanDuel Research. Big thank you to our YouTube producer, Justin Lane, for his work in the video side of things. Thank you, Justin, as always. And thank you all for tuning in throughout this year. We appreciate you. It's been a fun ride as always. Appreciate all the good comments, all the fun. You are all a fantastic audience. It's been a blast talking with you. We'll talk some golf and some NFL betting with you during the offseason as well. Enjoy the Super Bowl. Good luck to you. We'll talk to you all soon. This has been the Heat Check, a FanDuel Research podcast.